Why is there no archaeological evidence of the Exodus?
We're dealing with a highly embellished and theologically interpreted myth of origins for a nation.
There is no textual archaeological evidence for it.
These stories are not literally true.
The data do not support the historicity of the Exodus or of the figure of Moses.
There was no slavery in Egypt. There was no Exodus. Not in the way the Bible has it.
You always hear people saying there's no evidence for the Exodus. There's no evidence the Hebrews were ever there. There's, I don't know how they miss this stuff. You may remember, if you were in our archaeology sessions, that there is evidence that Semitic tribes actually moved at this time to Canaan, or to Egypt from the land of Canaan. This is called the Beni Hassan painting. It was discovered in 1964, not far from Saqqara, Egypt, which is just south of where the Great Pyramids are. And it's in a tomb of a pharaoh or a king who reigned from 1911 BC to 1870 BC. You can see these brightly colored robes. These are Semitic tribes making their way from the land of Canaan, what we now call Israel, to Egypt. And it depicts pastoral, nomadic Semites migrating to Egypt with children and livestock in tow. Elsewhere here in Genesis, it says that the Egyptians considered the shepherds to be lower class. They could never be shepherds. So these people are shepherds bringing livestock into the area, and they're dressed as Semites. They're not dressed as Egyptians. So archaeologists go, yeah, this is a migration of people coming from the land of Canaan to Egypt.
You just mentioned Egypt. Let's go on over to Egypt now. And there's something that's been discovered called the Brooklyn Papyrus. And you're wondering, why is it called the Brooklyn Papyrus? It's from Egypt, and because it's in a museum in Brooklyn. Is that the case? And what is it, Titus?
Yeah, Papyrus Brooklyn, in the Brooklyn Museum. They actually funded some archaeological work, and then they published this particular papyrus. But this is it's a list. So it doesn't sound super exciting. List of a bunch of names. They're servants in Egypt from the 17th century BC, kind of think time of Joseph. But when you look at the names, we see a couple of really interesting and important things. First of all, it shows how these people had their names changed to an Egyptian name, or they were given an Egyptian name, just like Joseph was. But then if we look at the original names, a bunch of them are what we would call Semitic. So this is the greater language family to which Hebrew belongs. About 30 of the 95 names we can see are Semitic. But when we look at those Semitic names, there are 9 that we could call biblical Hebrew names. That's extremely important because this helps to establish that there were Hebrews prior to the Exodus. And that's really one of the main points of evidence that I would say helps us to be able to document, look, there were Hebrews or Israelites in Egypt before the Exodus, just as we get from the book of Exodus.
See, we have a visual representation of the Israelites coming, and then there are names in something called the Brooklyn Papyrus. Does anyone know where the name Shipra, what that connects to?
The Hebrew
one of the Hebrew midwives that said, oh, these Hebrews, they give birth too quickly, Pharaoh. We can't kill all the children, all the male children. They've given birth before we ever get there. Shipra was one of the names. Also Issachar, one of the sons of Jacob. That name is in the Brooklyn Papyrus. It's called Brooklyn Papyrus because it's in Brooklyn, New York. It's
Please send it back. I need it.
It came from here, but it's housed in that museum. So you got the visual depiction of it, as he said, from 1876 BC, and then you've got names written in the Brooklyn Papyrus a little bit later when they're slaves, and so you have connections from Egypt that the Hebrews came here and were enslaved.
We are on the other side of the Valley of the Kings. The kings are buried on the other side of this mountain. On this side are noble people that weren't kings but were high officials. One high official was Rekhmire, who happened to be second in charge to both Thutmose III, who was the king or the pharaoh that wanted Moses dead, and Amenhotep II, his son, who became the pharaoh and was the pharaoh of the Exodus. Inside this tomb we're going to go into, we're going to see evidence of slaves making straw bricks right at the time of the Exodus. Let's take a look. We're in the Rekhmire tomb, just on the other side of the Valley of the Kings. This is where they buried nobles about the time of the Exodus. In fact, this tomb is thought to have been completed in 1450 BC, 4 years prior to the Exodus. This tomb was for the second in charge of both Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. Thutmose III is the pharaoh that wanted Moses dead. Amenhotep II is the pharaoh of the Exodus. And in this tomb, you have Semitic, or at least non-Egyptian slaves making mud bricks right at the time of the Exodus. This tomb has a connection to the Bible, and if you're going to say that the Bible is wrong about these people being enslaved, you also have to say that Egypt is wrong about these people being enslaved. Remember how Pharaoh talked about the fact that he wanted to keep the quota up, even though the Hebrews now were going to have to go out and get their own straw. We're not going to provide the straw. You go find it and then keep making the bricks. Was there a brick-making quota? Well, actually, there's evidence there was. This, called the Louvre leather roll, because it's in the Louvre Museum in Paris, comes from about 1274 BC. And what does this thing say? It shows brick-making quotas in Egypt. In fact, one quota was the fact that they had to make 2,000 bricks per day. That's a lot of bricks, especially when you got to collect the mud, and then you got to collect the straw, you got to put it in the mold, and then you got to set it out to dry in the sun. In fact, if they lacked materials to meet the quota, the slaves would be punished for it. So the quota goes up, or the quota stays the same, but the resources aren't there, they're going to get punished anyway. And of course, this corroborates brick-making process quotas and abuse as described in Exodus. So again, this comes out of Egypt. This is not, you always hear people saying there's no evidence for the Exodus, there's no evidence the Hebrews were ever there, I don't know how they miss this stuff. Now, granted, this is circumstantial. It doesn't directly say these were Hebrew slaves. It doesn't directly say from Egypt these things. But when you put all these pieces together, you go, There's too many coincidences here.
There's also evidence from the Egyptian pantheon of gods that shows that the writers of Exodus knew Egyptian theology. We're gonna go back to plague number 1, but I'm just leading off here with the 10th plague because of the phrase in Exodus 12:12, I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. Let me say this right now up front, that the plagues were not random catastrophes on Pharaoh and his people. The plagues were judgment on all the gods of Egypt, because each one of the plagues appears to be a slam, a judgment on the gods that the Egyptians worshipped. Moses must have known Egyptian culture. How did he even know about all these gods? How? Because he was there. That's why. Basically, this is almost like a playground taunt. My God can beat up your gods.
Something called the Apure Papyrus. And we talked about this a couple of years ago, and we talked about archaeology. I want to revisit it because it's so amazing that I don't think there's any other way you can conclude that they're talking from Egypt about the plagues. Because this Apure Papyrus, there's only one of these manuscripts in existence, and the date range on this is somewhere in the 2nd millennium BC. So this would be anywhere from a 600-year range. Some say as early as 1800 BC, maybe as late as 1200 or 1300 BC. The Exodus, we believe, took place in 1446 BC. This is also called Admonitions of an Egyptian Sage, meaning there's somebody in Egypt writing this papyrus, and you'll see what it says here in a minute. It lines up almost exactly with the plagues. Moses struck the water of the Nile, and all the water was changed into blood. The Egyptians dug along the Nile to get drinking water because they could not drink the water of the river. The Apure Papyrus says this: the river is blood, yet men drink of it. One thirsts for water. Also, Exodus says blood will be everywhere in Egypt. Apure Papyrus, pestilence is throughout the land. Blood is everywhere. Death is not lacking. How about Exodus 9? The hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on your livestock in the field, on your horses, donkeys, and camels, and on your cattle, sheep, and goats. Apure Papyrus, indeed, all animals, their hearts weep. Cattle moan because the state of the land. Exodus 9, a little later, and the hail struck down every plant of the field and broke every tree of the field. Apure Papyrus, lo, trees are felled, branches are stripped. How about Exodus 10? The locust came up over all the land of Egypt and settled on the whole country of Egypt, such a dense swarm of locusts as had never been before, nor never will be again. They covered the face of the whole land so that the land was darkened, and they ate all the plants in the land and all the fruit of the trees that the hail had left. Not a green thing remained, neither tree nor plant of the field, through all the land of Egypt. Impure birds find neither fruits nor herbs. Exodus 12, the people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians so that they had let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. So the Bible's saying, before they left, these Hebrews said, hey, Egyptians, give us some treasures as a parting gift. We need some treasures. Give us your jewelry. Give us all that stuff. The pure papyrus, what does it say? Gold and lapis lazuli, silver and malachite, carnelian and bronze are fastened on the necks of female slaves. Poor men have become owners of wealth, and he who could not make sandals for himself is now a possessor of riches. Coincidence? Doesn't seem to be, does it? All right, how about Exodus 10 again? So Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was pitch darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. Okay, so it's dark, right? The pure papyrus, the land is without light. How about Exodus 10:7? A little earlier, Pharaoh's officials said to him, how long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go so that they may worship the Lord, their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined? All is ruin indeed that has perished, which yesterday was seen. So a pure laments the utter and sudden destruction of the land. How about 12:30? And Pharaoh rose up in the night, and he and all his servants and all the Egyptians. And there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Plague of the firstborn. The pure groaning is throughout the land, mingled with laments. Lo, many dead are buried in the river. The stream is the grave. The tomb became a stream, and he who puts his brother in the ground is everywhere. Indeed, every dead person is a well-born man. Those who were Egyptians have become foreigners and are thrust aside. The children of princes are dashed against walls. Coincidence, right? A archaeologist, Christopher Imes, said this. He sums up the whole thing here in one quote. Researchers simply don't know the original dating for this document. It varies across a span of 6 centuries, and the latter end of the date spectrum may indeed align with the events of the Exodus. And as shown above, both documents complement each other so well. A river that became blood, pestilence, crops, livestock, buildings devastated, fire and darkness, well-born offspring dying, lame duck magicians, slaves pillaging the riches of masters, and a shepherding people whose initial presence in the land culminated in cataclysm. How could this not refer to the same event? How could it not? But there's no evidence for the Exodus. There's none. They keep telling you that. You know what they're doing? These people are allowing their paradigm to do their thinking for them. Oh, this is a closed question. There is no evidence for the Exodus. So no matter what evidence comes before me, I'm going to say there's no evidence for the Exodus. I'm not showing you all of it. These were just 5 or 6 lines of evidence from Egypt. So the Great Sphinx, which comes from about 2500 or so BC, maybe 2600 BC. Think about how old that's 4,600 years old. It's hard to believe, right? In any event, this stela right here was added at sometime in the 1400s BC, about, say, 1100 years later. Again, it's about 12 foot tall. It's right there between the paws of the Sphinx. We think it comes from about 1424 BC. All right? It tells King Thutmose IV, again, not the firstborn son of the Exodus Pharaoh, but another son, on a hunting trip, then resting by the Sphinx and having a vision or a dream. What did this vision or dream tell him? It said that if he cleared the sand from the Sphinx, the throne would be his. The throne would be his if he clears the sand from the Sphinx? Why would he need to do this? Why would he even need to put this inscription up?
Do you see the implication here that the Sphinx itself was built around 2500 BC? That stela, the dream stela, was put in 1424 BC. When was the Exodus? 1446 BC. Who was the pharaoh? Amenhotep II. Amenhotep II himself was not the firstborn. Somehow he got to the throne. He wasn't the firstborn. So when the 10th plague came in, he didn't die because he was not the firstborn. But he had a son who was the firstborn and vanishes from Egyptian history. We don't know what happened to him. That's why, as Mito just said, the second-born son had to put this stela up in order to give him legitimacy, to make him a legitimate ruler of Egypt. So this is circumstantial evidence that Amenhotep II is the pharaoh of the Exodus. His firstborn son has been killed in the plague. His second-born son said, oh, now I have the throne, and I'm going to say that Ra gave me a dream that authenticated my claim to the throne, and that's what that dream stela is saying.
Our friend, the great Joel Kramer, put out this video. And he is an archaeologist. So this video just came up just a couple of days ago. This video, after one day, had 500,000 views. Joel does great work, and he went to Amenhotep II's tomb. In Amenhotep II's tomb, when Leray went in 1898, he went way down into this tomb. He had known it had been looted because a lot of the valuables were gone, but he went down to the sarcophagus, and in the sarcophagus was the mummy of Amenhotep II. And then off in another room was this mummy, known as Webensenu. Webensenu is the first son of Amenhotep II. He was anywhere between 10 and 15 when he died. He also had this lock of hair where they would shave the head of the prince except for one lock of hair and let that lock of hair grow. That would designate that person as the next pharaoh. So if this truly is Amenhotep II's son, why did he die as a young boy? Died in the plague.
The gentleman you see standing next to me in Egypt is our guide, Mito Dito. He's a Christian and he's phenomenal. In this next clip, we're going to be standing in the Egyptian Museum, the old Egyptian Museum, and Mito is explaining to us that the Ark of Anubis, which was built by the Egyptians, appears to have the same design as the Ark of the Covenant. Might this mean that at least the Israelites were influenced not only by instructions from God, but by the Egyptians on how to build their own ark? Check this out.
This one is how we know the design, how we know the size. It had been drawn on the wall of the temple. So we take the same size and the same decoration and the same elements from the wall and we apply it, and when we finish it, it became like that. If you take this one and you apply it of what we know from the book of Exodus, when God is giving Moses the instruction to make what we called it the Ark of the Covenant. Take this one and think of it, you will find it is copy paste. It is going along with what God telling Moses to do. Even it has here holes or rings where they had a beam, put it inside and they could carry it over their shoulder. So it is exactly the Egyptian ark.
Here is the granddaddy of them all. Go to Exodus 3:15. This is nomads of Yahweh. This is Yahweh's name, the great I am. And it's also put forth as Yahweh. And it's called the Nomads of Yahweh inscription. Sometimes it's called the Shasu of Yahweh name ring. We'll get to that here in a minute. And it was found in 2 Egyptian temples in modern-day Sudan. Soleb, that's a 1400 BC inscription, and Amara West, a 1300 BC inscription. So you've got 2 Yahweh inscriptions in ancient Egypt. We don't have, as far as we know to this point, any Yahweh inscription that early from Israel.
And it's on this pillar right here on the backside. It's right here. I've come a very long way to see this inscription, which from the Egyptian hieroglyphics reads, "Land of the nomads of Yahweh." It dates to the end of the 15th century BC. It's over 3,400 years old, and that makes it the oldest mention in an inscription of the name of the God of Israel.
So basically, this inscription is saying there were nomads in Egypt who worshiped Yahweh. So this seems to me to be quite stunning evidence that you can respond with when somebody says there's no evidence that the Israelites were even in Egypt. Oh, really? Why are there inscriptions in Egypt? The oldest inscriptions ever that say Yahweh, these people worship Yahweh.
For more than 20 years, divers and explorers from 3 continents, each intrigued by clues linking the Gulf of Aqaba and the biblical Yam Suf, have come to Nuweiba Beach seeking possible evidence of an Israelite crossing. Their search focused on the 600 chariots the Bible says were destroyed in the Red Sea. Inscriptions thousands of years old, and the few chariots recovered from ancient tombs reveal much about the construction of these legendary vehicles of war. Could any of them actually be found on the seafloor off the Nuweiba Peninsula?
The first time I came to Nuweiba, the purpose was to verify, to document, and to establish hypotheses that this could be a link in the Exodus pathway.
Based on his analysis of documentary evidence, Leonard Moeller had long suspected the Aqaba coast as the probable location of the Red Sea crossing. In 1997, he heard reports from other divers who claimed to have found unusual coral structures, some resembling the shapes of chariot wheels. Moeller decided to investigate these claims for himself.
The first time I was diving there, of course, we were then looking for possible artifacts. And I had seen on some pictures what we could look for. I was skeptical and excited, because if this is the place for the crossing, then of course that's a big thing. So I was excited about that. But I was also skeptical because 3,500 years, that's a long time. But if Nuweiba is the crossing site, then of course you would expect to find remains of the Egyptian army.
Like others who had explored Nuweiba before him, Moeller immediately recognized the difficulty of this search.
If we assume that a number of artifacts were spread out on the seabed, sooner or later corals would start to grow on them. And of course, if you have a number of layers of coral growing on something, it's very hard to distinguish the structure that was there from the very beginning.
Though the coral complicates any search here, it may have been instrumental in preserving the shapes of ancient artifacts. For coral is a living organism that will not begin to grow on a foundation of sand or silt. Instead, it must first attach itself to a solid object, where it will sometimes conform to the shape of its host.
So for instance, if it would grow on a wooden artifact, the wood would normally disappear in the seawaters after a time. But if you have corals growing on the wooden artifact, the coral could have the shape of the wooden artifact. And then the corals would consume the wooden material over periods of time, but still keep the shape of the wooden artifacts.
During the course of his explorations, Moeller observed that the pattern of coral growth at Nueva differed from other parts of the Gulf. Unlike the coral at the northern and southern ends of Aqaba, which often forms large, dense reefs, some covering many acres, the formations at Nueva Beach are generally smaller and scattered randomly across the sea floor. Divers familiar with the area have compared the distribution of coral here to a junkyard and the aftermath of a disaster. This description is fitting, and among the strange formations in these waters, many display features indicative of human engineering.
When we dive and when we film at the Nueva location, we look for certain structures, and you try to look for 90-degree angles or circular objects, wheel-like structures. So that is what you scan for, so to speak, when you dive. There are situations where you see something that looks like an axle, a hub, something that looks like a wheel, and you say to yourself, this is not a coral reef, this is a coral growth on an artifact. And that is what's different to me when I compare corals at other locations around the world.
Since the earliest explorations at Nueva, one distinctive type of formation has often been identified on the sea floor. A slender, table-like structure, sometimes standing on end, with a coral-encrusted base, a straight shaft, and a circular top.
It's a 90-degree angle, a right angle, between something that looks like an axle and the wheel. And you can see this in different varieties, and it looks very different from normal coral growth. And it is like a man-made structure with a coral growth on it.
While most of the possible artifacts found off the coast of Nueva are covered with coral, one significant discovery was not.
There is one find at the Nueva location that is of great interest, and that is the gilded wheel. It is a wooden basic structure of the wheel and is covered with gold, or electrum. It's a mixture of silver and gold. And corals have not been able to grow on it. It's been very well preserved. Although it's very fragile, it seems like the wooden content has been dissolved. So I mean, you could break it if you would try to remove it.
After its discovery, the fragile wheel-shaped veneer was photographed, then left in place on the sea floor. Later analysis revealed that its dimensions and design resembled four-spoke chariot wheels painted on an 18th dynasty tomb wall near the biblical date of the Exodus. After reviewing photographic evidence and making several dives of his own, Moeller concluded that a more systematic investigation of the Nueva seafloor was warranted. He realized that the limited diving time afforded by scuba equipment would never allow an extensive search of the area. A higher level of technology was necessary, and in the spring of 2000, the Discovery Media team lowered a robotic camera into these waters for the first time.
This has never been done. No one have been in the area at all with a remote control camera.
Controlled from the ship, the camera was maneuvered across the seafloor, transmitting video images for study and evaluation.
We have been down to some 80-90 meters, so we can go deeper down that we can't do with ordinary diving, and we can be down as long as we like.
As in his previous searches at Nueva, Moeller scrutinized the coral for specific shapes.
We can see that because it's a 90-degree angle. You see the seabed here, there are some structures that are just a little bit above the surface of the seabed. They have a cross-like appearance, it's 90-degree angles, and there's a hole in the middle.
So the hub would be here?
Possibly a hub there, yeah. And the wheel would be a circle around.
This would be the rim of the wheel here?
Yeah.
Okay. So this could be a spoke here, possibly?
Yeah,
possibly a spoke?
Yeah.
What would the diameter of that rim be?
That's a good question, but we would expect it to be about 1 meter, about 3 feet wide.
Okay.
In diameter.
The robotic camera's survey revealed many shapes and objects familiar to Moeller, including coral formations with right angles, arches, discs, and straight shafts fused into larger masses that had the appearance of twisted wreckage.
Now, when we have been able to go back and forth with the remote control camera, we can repeatedly see that these strange structures we are looking for are there. Not at one place, but you see them again and again and again. And this could be the outer rim of a wheel going around like
The
that.
abundance of these unusual coral structures was even more apparent when tapes of the expedition were carefully scrutinized during the months following the search at Nueva.
Perhaps have a wheel here, standing on the seabed. When you sit and look at these films that has been taken by the remote camera, you see all these strange artifacts or coral growth on some artifacts or structures that appear repeatedly, time after time, at different locations at this spot. And you can sit there and think, well, what is this? This doesn't look like normal coral growth. And it is amazing to see that so many things and such large areas down there that are like a man-made structure.
While the robotic camera logged hours of video documentation, Viveka Pontien and other divers on a second research vessel used metal detectors to evaluate specific structures on the sea floor. Pontien and her colleagues realized that the wheels of many Egyptian chariots were often reinforced with bronze. They hoped to find evidence of the metal encrusted in coral. A scan of this formation indicated a circular metallic pattern around its edge, perhaps evidence of the broken rim of a chariot wheel. Other coral formations examined also contained fragments of metal. Viveka Pontien's interest in this research was heightened by a discovery she had made 3 years earlier, 8 miles due east of the Nueva Peninsula. During her stay in Saudi Arabia, Pontien not only searched for Mount Sinai, she also made several dives in an attempt to document evidence of the Egyptian army on the Saudi side of the Gulf.
And the Bible tells that Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore after they came across. So I figured there must be some stuff on the Saudi side. At one spot there is like a very shallow sort of land tongue going out in a straight angle towards Nuweiba. You could tell it by the shift of the color of the water. You could see how it was turquoise far out, you know. So I thought this would be interesting for exploration, so we did some dives near to that.
The scattered, irregular coral formations on the Saudi side of Aqaba resemble those previously found off the Nuweiba Peninsula. In the midst of them, Pan Tien photographed this circular object attached to what appears to have been a broken axle or hub. This discovery was significant for two reasons. Pan Tien had documented the coral-encrusted form of a wheel with dimensions similar to ancient Egyptian artifacts directly across from the proposed Nuweiba crossing site. Her find also provided independent confirmation of earlier evidence establishing wheel-like formations on both coasts of the Red Sea, in accordance with descriptions in the biblical record.
And the Lord looked down on the Egyptian army, and he made the wheels of their chariots come off.
A common question is, why didn't you bring up artifacts? And there are several answers to that. The best thing to do when you find something is just to keep it in position. Document it, but keep it in position. It's very easy to destroy anything. And the other thing, it's illegal to remove artifacts, but also you're not allowed to bring up any corals from the Red Sea.
While Egyptian environmental laws prohibit removal of any coral for scientific dating and analysis, photographic evidence may provide a link to the time of the Exodus. Scholars have recognized that the design of the chariot wheel can be used to identify specific periods in Egyptian history. In the waters of Aqaba, it appears that remnants of 4- and 6-spoke wheels have been discovered. These designs were used simultaneously only during Egypt's 18th dynasty and no later than about 1400 BC, a time frame that coincides closely to the biblical date of the Exodus. The discoveries made between Nuweiba Beach and Saudi Arabia have been fascinating, but they also raise some obvious questions. If God parted these waters, how could a large group of people, including the elderly and the very young, have walked across the Gulf of Aqaba?
And since we know that the Gulf of Aqaba is terribly deep, because there is a very deep section in the crust of the earth that goes from the Dead Sea through Gulf of Aqaba, down through the main part of the Red Sea and down into Ethiopia, and it's called the Rift Valley there.
The imposing terrain of the Great Rift Valley is evident in the towering mountains that line the Aqaba coast. They drop straight down into the sea, creating an underwater canyon more than a mile deep, a seemingly impassable divide, even if devoid of water. While surveying the subsurface topography of the Nuweiba crossing site, evidence was uncovered that could help explain how Israel walked from one coast to the other. At its steepest points, the Gulf of Aqaba plunges more than 5,500 feet. Yet the ocean floor off the coast of Nuweiba Beach rises up several thousand feet from this trench, creating a wide, flattened ridge that the Israelites could have crossed once the Red Sea was divided. Simulated to scale in this computer animation, the view of the Gulf south of the Nueva Peninsula is striking. A chasm, deeper than the Grand Canyon, extends more than 50 miles. Its steep shorelines stand in sharp contrast to the shallow grade of the gently sloping ridge that extends from Nueva Beach to Saudi Arabia. It is a ridge that resembles what the Old Testament prophet Isaiah once called a pathway through the mighty waters. The robotic camera was used to evaluate the physical characteristics of this undersea ridge for the first time.
It's just flat, extremely flat, and very wide. There are no corals, there are no pieces of rock, and we followed that far out in the Gulf of Aqaba. It got deeper and deeper, but it was very flat all the time. And the interesting thing is also that the material on the seabed is not mud, as it is in the Gulf of Suez or at other places. It's a thin layer of sand or silt. It is easy to walk on it if you take away the water, and there would be no limit to have an enormous amount of people there, except the water, of course, but that's not our problem. God took care of that.
Thus says the Lord, who makes a way through the sea and a path through the mighty waters. Come and see the works of God. He turned the sea into dry land, and they passed through on foot.
While the existence of an underwater ridge stretching from Nueva Beach to Saudi Arabia may make it easier to understand how the Israelites could have crossed the Aqaba Gulf, it does not explain the actual parting of these waters in the manner described by the writers of the Exodus account.
My understanding at Nuweiba is that if the water was removed so they could cross there, it is nothing that we could explain from a scientific point of view, period.
Well, if you look at the Red Sea crossing as it's described in the Bible, what you clearly see there is this situation where a wind has come up and has dried out the land for them to cross. But then there's this element where the waters have formed a wall to the left and the right of the Israelites as they pass through. And they say that 2 or 3 times, so it's quite clear in their memory that the waters were like a wall. And there's just no naturalistic explanation for something like that.
For those who accept the idea that God could have divided the Red Sea by performing a miracle, the lack of naturalistic explanation poses no difficulty. Scholars, however, have generally assumed that miracles are impossible because they violate the laws of nature. As a result, any document based on a miraculous event must be historically unreliable. This reasoning, though widespread, is not without opposition. Some scholars, including the late Oxford philosopher and writer C.S. Lewis, have noted that accounts of biblical miracles display features of genuine historical literature. Lewis, in particular, argued that miracles, properly understood, never violate natural law.
It is inaccurate to define a miracle as something that breaks the laws of nature. It doesn't. Laws of nature tell what will happen, provided there's no interference. A miracle is an interference with nature by a supernatural power. Miraculous elements in a biblical narrative do not, therefore, preclude its historicity.
C.S. Lewis believed that miracles are acts of God, and therefore entirely possible if there is a God to take action.
If you assume that God doesn't exist, then miracles are impossible, of course. But if God does exist, then there's the possibility that miracles could have occurred. So when we're looking at events in the Bible like this, we have to be objective when we come to the evidence. We have to look at the data and say, is it really clear enough that a miracle might have really occurred here? If we objectively look at the evidence then, and it really seems to lead in the direction of something miraculous, then we need to be open to that.
After more than a century of research, where does the body of available evidence for the Exodus now lead? Many archaeologists have attempted to trace the path of Israel's journey to Mount Sinai. The routes they have most frequently proposed have yielded little or nothing in the way of actual confirmation. Yet today, another theory for the Israelites' path, far different from traditional ideas, may provide a trail of direct evidence for both a miracle and the historical validity of the Exodus account. Beginning in northeastern Egypt, Egyptian records and archaeological excavations document the presence of a Hebrew slave population several centuries prior to the probable time of the Exodus. Evidence also shows that the Hebrews later appeared in Canaan, the promised land, after centuries of bondage. Historical documents and possibly archaeological evidence locate the Mountain of God in northwest Arabia, the site of biblical Midian. And a trade route leading to Midian, intersected by a system of riverbeds terminating at the Aqaba coast, matches biblical and historical descriptions of the Israelites' path to the Red Sea. There, in the waters off Nuweiba Beach, structures resembling 18th dynasty chariot wheels lie embedded in coral on an elevated ridge that connects the Sinai and Arabian peninsulas.
So then you have a lot of things that you can put together to build a picture, like a puzzle. And we find artifacts, and we find geography, locations and surroundings, so to speak, around this that fits the text very well.
Well, a good scientific theory explains a lot of evidence very simply and coherently. And there's a pattern that's coming out of this evidence that really suggests that the biblical record has a lot more historical content to it than what scholars have been willing to grant in the past. So the question no longer is, why don't we find any evidence for the Exodus? But instead, what do we do with this evidence that we now have that clearly seems to support the biblical record?
The scriptures tell us that nearly 3,500 years ago, God parted the waters of the Red Sea and led the Israelites to freedom. Did it happen here? Did it happen at all? Is the biblical description factually accurate? As with any historical investigation, we may never know with absolute certainty. And so, perhaps belief in the Exodus will always require a measure of faith. But facts and faith need not conflict, as recent discoveries suggest. For history and archaeology have now uncovered compelling reasons to reconsider the extraordinary claims of the Exodus story.